He thought he knew his company until a single tear from a cashier shattered everything he believed in. Disguised beneath a hoodie and glasses, the CEO of one of America's fastest-growing retail chains walked into a modest downtown branch of his own company, aiming to quietly observe the daily operations and understand how employees were treated without the filter of boardroom reports or middle management summaries. But as he stepped inside and blended with the morning crowd, he noticed something odd. Customers lined up impatiently while only one cashier struggled alone at the register, her eyes red and watery, hands trembling slightly as she scanned items, and apologized repeatedly for the delay. And while the other employees were nowhere to be seen, the atmosphere was tense, customers grumbling. Yet the girl kept working with forced smiles, until one impatient man slammed his cart against the counter, demanding faster service, causing her to whisper, "I'm sorry," again, as tears welled up in her eyes. And that's when the undercover CEO knew something was seriously wrong. So he quietly joined the line, observing how she wiped her face discreetly and kept moving, even offering a candy to a child in line, despite her own visible stress. And when his turn came, she didn't recognize him, of course, and simply asked how his day was going, her voice breaking halfway through. And instead of answering, he leaned in and asked gently, "Are you okay?" And the dam broke. She looked around quickly, shook her head, and whispered, "I'm just tired, sir," before ringing up his items without another word. But the CEO left the store quietly and circled around to the back entrance, flashing his ID to security and requesting access to the manager's office, where he found two supervisors laughing over coffee, one on the phone talking about ditching morning duties. And when confronted, they laughed nervously until he removed his disguise, revealing his true identity, and their faces drained of color as he demanded to know why one cashier was left alone during peak hours while they relaxed in private. To which one stammered something about short staffing. But the truth came out fast. The cashier, named Eliza, had taken extra shifts after her mother's surgery, had been covering for two absent colleagues, and despite requesting help repeatedly, was ignored by managers who called her too emotional and overly sensitive, even mocking her behind her back. And the CEO, shocked by the cruelty, called for an emergency staff meeting, bringing Eliza into the office where she froze in fear until he assured her she wasn't in trouble, only asking her to speak freely. And what she revealed was worse: how she'd worked overtime for weeks without proper pay, how her requests for breaks were denied, how she cried not just from stress, but from knowing no one cared, and that she'd nearly quit that morning before deciding to just push through. And the CEO listened silently, then turned to the entire branch team now assembled and fired the two supervisors on the spot, replacing them with interim staff from corporate, and then announced that Eliza would not only be promoted, but would also receive back pay and a mental health support package. And as tears flowed again, this time from shock and gratitude, customers in the store began applauding as word spread quickly, someone having recorded the earlier confrontation and uploaded it to social media, where it exploded, millions praising the CEO's reaction, but also calling out the corporate world's blind spots when it comes to frontline workers. And the CEO, humbled, announced a company-wide audit of all locations, promising to visit more stores personally and install anonymous feedback channels to hear from employees directly. And Eliza, once invisible, became a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring others to speak up. And though she never sought attention, her sincerity touched hearts worldwide, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single tear. Eliza sat quietly in the break room of the corporate headquarters 2 weeks after the viral incident, her hands clasped tightly on her lap as she waited for the next step in a life that had changed overnight. And although she was still adjusting to the sudden shift from being an overworked cashier to a company figurehead, her humility remained untouched. For while the internet had praised her strength, Eliza knew that behind every tear shed at that register had been weeks of silent suffering and unheard pleas. And now, as she sat surrounded by HR reps, a PR consultant, and the very CEO who had walked into her store in disguise, she listened to plans for a new employee wellness initiative being named in her honor, the Eliza Care Program, a system designed to monitor working conditions, offer anonymous support, and ensure that every employee's voice, no matter how small, was finally heard. And while the idea of her name being used across hundreds of stores made her nervous, the sincerity in the CEO's voice reassured her as he shared that her courage had exposed a systemic rot that spreadsheets and charts could never reveal. And Eliza, remembering the many sleepless nights where she had stayed past closing to finish duties alone, felt both honored and overwhelmed, yet determined to use her new platform not for fame but for justice, especially after receiving hundreds of emails from strangers, other cashiers, janitors, delivery drivers sharing their own stories of being mistreated, overlooked, or emotionally broken by the same kind of toxic micromanagement she had endured. And while the media attention was intense, Eliza asked to return to the store once more, not to work, but to speak with the very customers who had witnessed her breakdown, because she wanted them to see her not as a viral story, but as a real person with fears, hopes, and the same desire for dignity as anyone else. And as she stood at the register again, this time not in a uniform, but in a modest blazer provided by the company, a small crowd gathered, some clapping, some crying, and one little girl shyly handed her a drawing of a superhero with brown hair and a name tag that said, Miss Eliza. And Eliza knelt down, hugged the girl, and smiled for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile that wasn't shadowed by exhaustion. And though some former employees of the store still looked on with guilt or jealousy, most were simply in awe of how someone so ordinary had become the center of something extraordinary. And the CEO, watching from nearby, made a silent vow that day to never again rely on numbers alone, to step out of meetings and into the spaces where real people lived their work. Because it was there, in the underpaid trenches of his empire, where truth breathed and bled. And in the weeks that followed, sweeping changes began. Toxic managers were let go across regions, feedback boxes filled to the brim, support lines received record calls, and Eliza was invited to speak at leadership summits not as a symbol, but as a guide, offering first-hand accounts of what corporate policies looked like at ground level. And her words, though simple, were raw with truth. Don't tell us we're a family if you won't sit with us when we're breaking, she said once, and that line alone was quoted by thousands, printed on posters in break rooms, and echoed in conference calls where executives now faced the human consequences of neglect. And while some resisted the change, the wave was too strong, because for every Eliza, there were dozens more waiting for someone to see them. And the CEO knew that the future of his company now depended not on expansion, but on empathy, not on profit margins, but on human dignity. And as he watched Eliza walk through the lobby with confidence he'd never seen before, he realized something he hadn't known even after years of success, that the strength of any company lies not in its branding or growth charts, but in how it treats the quietest voices on its floors. And Eliza, once invisible, had become that voice for thousands, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she kept going when no one else cared. And now, finally, the world had listened. And yet, even as Eliza's story continued to ripple through the company, she remained grounded in the values that had carried her through her darkest moments: kindness, patience, and the unwavering belief that doing the right thing mattered even when no one noticed. And it was that very belief that led her to suggest one more initiative to the CEO during a quiet elevator ride: a mentorship program pairing veteran frontline workers with new hires to create a culture of support from the very beginning. And while the board had initially seen it as unnecessary, Eliza presented her case with such clarity and sincerity that no one could deny its value. And when the program launched, Dozens of employees wrote in to say how having someone to lean on during training had made all the difference, and Eliza, now working in a special advisory role, took the time to visit stores weekly, not as an executive but as a listener, a supporter, a presence that reminded everyone that no position was too small to be respected. And though she never sought power, her influence was undeniable, proving that one broken voice, when finally heard, can rebuild an entire system from the inside out. Asterisk. Months had passed since the day Eliza's tears sparked a transformation that would ripple through the entire company. And while the media frenzy had faded, the real work had just begun. As hundreds of stores across the country began implementing changes rooted in her story, managers trained in emotional intelligence, anonymous reporting lines made active, and a growing culture that valued human dignity as much as efficiency. But what remained most powerful was Eliza's consistent presence in the field, showing up unannounced at stores, not with cameras or fanfare, but with a notebook, a warm smile, and the simple words, "How are you really doing?" Words that had become more revolutionary than any policy drafted in a boardroom. And in one such visit to a struggling rural branch, she met a young mother named Marla who reminded her so much of herself at Hurt, a woman juggling 2 jobs, caring for a disabled child, and still managing to hold the register line with a tired smile. And Eliza, listening to her story, felt the same anger and sadness rise again. Not just at the system that failed people like Marla, but at the silence that had allowed it for so long. And so she brought Marla's case directly to the CEO, not demanding charity, but advocating for a formal hardship grant program that would allow employees in crisis to apply for direct support without shame or red tape. And once again, after a heartfelt presentation where Eliza shared how close she herself had come to walking away before being seen, the board approved the initiative unanimously, naming it the Phoenix Fund, to honor those who rise even when burned by exhaustion. And as success stories poured in, the company began to change at its core, not just on paper, but in soul, with store cultures shifting from survival mode to solidarity, where coworkers checked on each other, managers led with compassion, and customers even noticed the difference. With one viral post describing a warmth in the store experience that hadn't existed before, and all of it, quietly and steadily, traced back to Eliza's resolve. But despite the praise, she continued to wrestle with the emotional weight of her journey, often waking at night reliving the moment she broke down at that register, haunted not by shame, but by how close she'd come to giving up without ever knowing that change was possible. And it was during one of those sleepless nights that she began drafting a letter, not for the public, not for the CEO, but for her younger self, the girl who used to sit in the break room holding back tears so her coworkers wouldn't see. The girl who stayed late while others clocked out early. The girl who feared that kindness made her weak. And in that letter, she wrote, "You are not soft, you are strong in the ways the world forgets to reward." And that phrase stuck with her, eventually becoming the tagline of a new campaign she proposed. A storytelling platform where employees from all backgrounds could share their journeys without filters or shame. And with support from leadership, the campaign launched internally under the name Real Voices, quickly growing into a library of courage videos, letters, audio diaries, each one a testament to the silent resilience that had built the company long before profits ever did. And while some executives worried the rawness of the stories might expose flaws, the CEO backed Eliza fully, insisting that authenticity was the brand now, not perfection. And that shift resonated far beyond their walls, with other corporations reaching out to understand how they'd managed to create a workplace people actually believed in again. And though Eliza often deflected credit, everyone knew it was her presence, not her position, that made the difference, because she hadn't risen through strategy or politics, but through surviving and still choosing compassion. And even when offered higher executive roles, she declined, choosing instead to remain connected directly to the people she had always fought for. saying simply, "I don't want to lead from above, I want to walk beside." And so she continued, visiting stores, mentoring new hires, reading every message sent to the Real Voices inbox late into the night. And in one of those messages came a note from a man named Carlos, an overnight janitor who had never spoken up before, but felt compelled to share how, after watching Eliza's video, he finally asked for help dealing with anxiety. And for the first time in years, someone listened, and Eliza, reading that message alone in her apartment, cried not out of sorrow, but out of a quiet joy that even one more person had been spared the silence she once endured. And it was that moment that defined everything, not the applause, not the policies, but the simple fact that by being honest about her pain, she'd opened a door for others to heal, and in that healing, the company had found a new foundation, one not built on metrics or margins, but on truth and trust, and the unshakable idea that every unheard voice matters. A full year had passed since Eliza's tearful shift at Register 3 unknowingly set into motion the largest cultural shift the company had ever experienced. And yet she still walked into every store with the same humility, the same quiet strength, and the same deeply human question that had become her signature. "How are you really doing?" A phrase that now appeared on breakroom posters, employee handbooks, and even training modules for new managers. But for Eliza, it wasn't a catchphrase or a campaign. It was a promise, a lifeline she had once needed herself and now offered to others like sacred currency. And as the Phoenix Fund supported over 500 employees in its first year, and the Real Voices project gained recognition beyond the company's borders, invitations poured in from universities, labor conferences, and even government advisory panels asking Eliza to speak, to consult, to lead on employee well-being from a grassroots lens. But every time she stood at a podium, she spoke not as a leader, but as a worker who still remembered the weight of exhaustion, the isolation of being unheard, and the quiet shame of crying alone behind a register. And she always reminded her audience that the real heroes weren't in suits or headlines, but behind counters, on warehouse floors, wiping tables, restocking shelves, and showing up day after day despite the invisible burdens they carried. And though her words often brought standing ovations, it was never applause she sought, it was action, tangible changes that would outlive her spotlight, which is why she focused her time on developing what she called care infrastructure, a layered system where compassion wasn't just preached but built into operations, budgets, and daily metrics. And under her guidance, store evaluations began including empathy scores, measured not by surveys, but by peer recognition, manager accessibility, and stress reporting trends. And while skeptics at first resisted, the data proved undeniable. Employee retention improved, customer satisfaction rose, sick days declined, and for the first time, exit interviews started ending with thank yous instead of resentment. And yet Eliza knew that the work was far from over, because even with progress, stories still arrived. In her inbox, everyday stories of overlooked staff, subtle discrimination, emotional burnout, and she treated each one as a call to action, often forwarding cases directly to HR or visiting locations herself, unannounced, to witness conditions firsthand. And during one such visit to a coastal city store, she met an elderly stock clerk named Henry who had worked quietly for 18 years, never promoted, rarely acknowledged, but still arriving every morning at 5 a.m. to stack shelves with care. And when asked why he never applied for advancement, he simply said, "I didn't think anyone saw me." And something about that answer stayed with Eliza for weeks, echoing in her thoughts until she proposed a new initiative, legacy recognition, designed to highlight long-term frontline workers not just for their tenure, but for their human stories, their impact, their unspoken mentorship. And Henry was the first recipient, honored not with a plaque, but with a store celebration, a bonus, and the kind of heartfelt acknowledgement that he later described as the first time I felt like I mattered. And Eliza, watching from the corner with tears in her eyes, felt once again that familiar mix of sorrow and hope, that so many had been invisible for so long. And yet so many still had time to be seen, to be honored, to be heard, and it was this mission that kept her grounded, refusing offers to write books or join high-paying consulting firms, instead choosing to remain with the people whose lives she understood from within, because no amount of recognition could replace the sacred bond she felt with the forgotten, the dismissed, the silenced. And though she now sat in meetings with department heads and analysts, she never let them forget the smell of the break-room coffee, the ache of standing 8 hours, the sound of a customer yelling while no one came to help, and when one executive joked that she was too emotional to be objective, the CEO himself responded that emotion saved this company, and silence followed. As it always did when truth entered the room, and in that silence, Eliza smiled not with triumph, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had earned every inch of change not through strategy or power but through showing up with compassion in the face of indifference. And as she looked ahead to the future, she didn't imagine a title or legacy, but a day when no worker would have to cry alone at their post, when empathy wouldn't be radical, and when dignity would no longer need defending. And in that vision, she found peace. Asterisk.